Shalom and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bread, where we discuss the weekly Parashat. This week's Parashat is called Bamidbar, and it's the first Parashat of the book of Bamidbar, also called Numbers, and it means in the wilderness. So in this week's Parashat, we see the numbering of the children of Israel from 20 years old and over, and the assembling of the tribes around the tabernacle. We also see the arrangement of the Levi'im and the priests, and then we also see their roles and responsibilities given, and then the laws for moving the tabernacle. And in the Haftorah, we see the prophecy of the northern house of Israel being scattered and then returned. So in this week's Parashat, we start off with the numbering of the men who are 20 years old and over in order to be able to go to war. And what we see is this is a big thing. This was a time, basically, going to war is a serious thing. And really, it was more than that. It was kind of the age of accountability, which is now you can, be a full citizen, essentially, of Israel. And you're also accountable to all of the rules and responsibilities of society. Now, my message for this year is called Roles and Responsibilities. And what we see is that this starts with accountability. Now, in order to be accountable, you have to have two things. You have to have a structure or a standard. For us, that's the Torah. And then you have to have someone who holds you accountable to that standard, which for us is Yodewahe. But what we have is we have a real problem with accountability right now because both of those things fall under the umbrella of authority. The standard is the authority, and then the authority to hold you accountable to the standard. So what we have when we look at this concept of coming of age, of standing on your own 2 feet, what do you normally see with people this age, 15 years old to 20 years old, can be a know-it-all, can resist authority, they want to do things on their own, the way they want to do them. We see Israel has a lot of the same trouble. And we're going to see that throughout the journey in the wilderness, but we're going to learn about that in this week's Parashat. So when we look at the three main religions that are based off of the Bible, we see Judaism, Christianity, and Messianics. And we see that every one of them has the same problem, and it starts off with accountability, and it starts off with authority. So we start with the Jews. The Jews don't believe that the New Testament is authoritative. It's an authority issue. They don't believe that necessarily came from God. And but if you look at the New Testament, really all the New Testament is the story of Mashiach, and what he did is he came back and tried to get the Jews to keep the Old Testament, their own Bible, and they rejected his interpretations, which were ultimately the truth of how it was supposed to be done. Because they'd already figured it out. They'd been doing it their way. They had their own interpretations, and they'd set the standard. And they weren't willing to either accept the true standard. Number two, they weren't willing to be held accountable to that standard. So when we talked about accountability, we see that those two key problems, the same problems that the Jews have and had, still, it's an issue of accountability. And so a lot of times they ended up taking on the teachings of other men or tradition, and they weren't taught those key things you need to learn before that age of accountability, which is how to humble yourself, how to not think you know it all, how to receive correction, and all this and that. Had those things been in place in many ways, it would have been easier for them to accept Mashiach and to evaluate them. Now we get to Christianity, we see a similar problem with authority. We see that the Christians don't believe in the authority of the Old Testament. They essentially, either through dispensation, or that was for another time, or that was for the Jews, or whatever it was, they believe in the New Testament. Well, belief in the New Testament is fine, but logically they have to realize one simple flaw. Jesus didn't have or teach from the New Testament. The Bible of Jesus was the Old Testament. The Bible of all of his followers, if he was a new religion, which he wasn't, even if you claim he was, all of his followers had an Old Testament in their hand. That was their Bible. There was no New Testament in existence during Jesus' life, essentially. So this concept where later day Christians build a religion based on a book that wasn't even the original book used in the religion that they're claiming that they're a part of. So they have an unauthentic religion if they base the religion off the New Testament, because the New Testament religion, the narrations of those New Testament followers, their religion was based off of their Bible at the time, which was the Old Testament. So New Testament's a great companion. It's a great book that goes in addition to the Torah, but the Bible that they all had in their hand, when 2 Timothy says all Scripture is profitable for reproof, correction, and instruction, the Scriptures he's referring to is the Old Testament, all of the Old Testament, because that's what they had. And so logically we have to start off with the concept that the Old Testament is the Bible of Jesus, and if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you need to have the same Bible as him and all of his followers had if you want to be authentic. And according to that, anything written in the New Testament can't change or disrupt anything in the Old Testament, because that was actually the Bible. Otherwise, you'd have something that Jesus and his followers didn't do, and it's contrary to what him and his followers did. So we start off with that. There's a problem of authority, that they don't believe in the Bible of Jesus and in its validity and authority. In that same sense, they don't believe in living in the way that Jesus lived, because Jesus' authority was the Old Testament. And they don't believe that the authority over them is the same authority that was over him. They claim that he is their Messiah, but they refuse and they reject the way he lived and the book from which he taught. So I don't know where that leaves you. It ultimately is just a rejection of him. If you reject the way that a person lived his whole life, and he's the teacher, and you're supposed to be his follower or his disciple, and you reject everything that he lived by, then you're really not his follower. There'd be no way to know that you were his follower, other than just what you say. But this goes back to the concept they reject his standard, right? Goes back to accountability. There's a standard. They reject his standard, which was the Torah, and the authority of it, so to be held accountable to it. So they have the same issue as the Jews, an accountability issue. Then we get to the Messianics. The Messianics, same type of situation. They say, well, we've got the New Testament and the Old Testament, but what it really ends up doing a lot of times when you look at the fruit is a lot of times Messianics take on the non-Torah trappings of Judaism. In other words, the kippah, the talit, walking around saying oy vey and learning Hebrew, and all that stuff's great, and it's all extraneous from the Torah. Because the Torah is where the value of the Jews were. God took his special people out, and then he filtered them out. Because the ones who wouldn't obey, he killed them off. He gave them plagues, he killed them, people wouldn't obey, and then only the ones who were willing to obey were taken into the promised land. So you have a situation where, I mean, how much value do you put in the people, the descendants of Abraham that disobeyed the Torah? Where was their value? Because they were destroyed for disobedience. So it wasn't, I don't know what the value in saying, it was probably even worse if they said, well, I'm a seed of Abraham, but I refuse to do what you said. That's probably worse than the strangers of the nations who aren't doing it, but they were never the seed of Abraham. So you have a situation where Messianics have the Old and the New Testament, but what they end up extracting out of that is all these cultural things that have nothing to do with the Torah. They get that from Judaism. And then they mix that with salvation doctrine that they get from the New Testament and from Christianity. This concept that the whole point of the Bible is to be saved instead of to obey, to learn the judgment of God and obey, and learn how to obey God. That's what the core message is. But they blend the worst of two worlds, and they end up getting something that's almost worse than either one of those by itself. And so they got a problem with standard, right? They still got the problem with standards, because in one mouth they say we're special because we have the Torah, and in the other mouth they say, but it has nothing to do with salvation. Salvation's really the goal of the Bible. So they're kind of double talking, and you get this weird confusion. And, that's why the Jews say, oh, Messianics, they're just Christians who are trying to convert, who are essentially, the funny thing is, the Jews, when they're talking about Messianics, I was watching a video the other day, breaking it down, and they said basically they're just Christians who've taken on, who are wearing kippot and talits and all this, so they can convert Jews. And it's funny because how they see that coming towards Judaism, to convert Jews to Jesus, essentially. They give kind of an honest appraisal of what's wrong with Messianic movement, is that, it is just a lot of times the Christian theology wrapped in a talit. And so it would be different if they said, wow, now here's this group of Messianics who keeps the Torah more strict than we do. They reject the traditions of men and interpretations, and are purists in the way that they keep the Torah. And they have this New Testament that seems to establish the strict guidelines in the Torah. And look at all these things. Now, that would be something that would be worth saying about them, but we don't have the ability to be said that in general about us. And that's a problem. So all these things come back to accountability. The standards are wrong because what happens? Judaism, Christianity, and Messianics. They can interpret what the standards are. That's the first problem. The standards aren't set. And when you have Yodewahe or Moshe among you, they can simply say, that's not what I said. This is how to do it. And there's no arguing. But right now, we can say, well, I think that word actually means this. And we can interpret it any way we want. So we set the standards. So now the standards are no standards. Number two, there's no authority there burning us up on the spot for doing it wrong. The earth isn't swallowing us up. And when we do something wrong, so that everyone else who watched Korach says, wow, don't do what that guy just did. Don't gather kindling on the Sabbath. Man, that guy just got stoned. We don't have either of those elements, and that creates a real problem right now. So what we have is essentially idolatry. And people may not want to hear it, but the reality is idolatry and its mechanics is where you form a God in the way that you see God, that your God should be. And the God can't argue with you because it's an idol and you formed it. So it's naturally already in agreement with you. And if you say that the little idol wants me to go over there, or the little idol says, well, I'm not supposed to work on the Sabbath, but it's okay to go to the store and buy a latte, or whatever you say, the little idol isn't going to argue. And that's where we are with religion right now. Everybody's interpreting the scriptures how they want. They take their own bribes, which means they essentially change the judgment of what should be a lot of times to fit what their needs are. If they wanted to roast a chicken on the Sabbath, then they would say, well, it's not just reheating the chicken, it's not really roasting, it's not baking. That verse, they can, whatever it is, people can make it any way they want. It's really a form of idolatry in the way that God a lot of times is being worshipped. And the best that we can do is hope to study and find what we believe the truth is, and know we could still make mistakes. But at least if we've studied, which most people aren't doing, then we wouldn't be in trouble as much as if we just listen to this is how it's always been taught. This is what the rabbi says. This is what the pastor says, whatever. Then if they're wrong, you're at zero because you've done no study. So there's nowhere for you to go. You could go years doing the wrong thing and find out you're nowhere. Whereas at least if you studied and were wrong and came to the wrong conclusions, but you'd studied, you got that experience. You've been in the Word. You've got more under your belt to draw from, to look back and say, okay, this is why I thought that, which led to that, but I figured out that was wrong. So let me retrace that and realize where it should go. Then you can learn and grow. So let's go to the second part of this parashat. The first part was the 20-year-old, the age of accountability, and we're talking about accountability in the Torah. What do we have accountability to being followers of God? Next, we'll talk about social responsibility. Now, for a lot of people, social responsibility, that sounds like what they've been arguing about on the news, is that communism? Is that, that's thrown around a lot in politics. The fact is that the Torah requires social responsibility. There's no getting around it. Social responsibility is all throughout the Torah. We can see it in various things like corners of the field. Everybody who harvested was to leave the corners of the field. In other words, they couldn't consume everything that they'd gotten for increase. They had to leave some for the poor, the widow, and the fatherless. And this ensured that nobody who was part of God's community was left destitute with nothing. They may not be rich, but they were never left destitute. And it came at the hands of the people who had any kind of increase. So we get this concept that now, right, in our society, things like welfare, they're all politicized. Social Security, unemployment, all of these, they call them entitlements. First thing we got to start doing is thinking, not about political parties, but about the Torah. Because we need to train our minds to be more Torah-based. I don't care about Republicans and Democrats. That's propaganda. That's a big propaganda machine where all their marketing, and I'm a marketing guy, that's my profession, all their marketing is designed around getting you to be trained like a dog, to growl on command at the other party, whoever they don't like. So each party demonizes the other party and then tries to get an emotional reaction out of each issue so that you get so entrenched that when anyone even talks about it, you lose your temper, you're angry at them, you don't want to talk to them anymore. They do that so that you won't change sides, because each of them wants to accumulate. They're masters at accumulating more votes. So the first thing that you got to do is start to realize that compromise comes when you listen to an opposing, this is intelligence, when you listen to an opposing viewpoint, being able to do that without getting upset and shutting your ears off and your mind off, that's just being smart, because that's how you learn and grow. If all you ever do is listen to, your own ideas and everything that agrees with you, again, that's the problem. That's the problem with religion. It's the problem with politics right now. That's why people like that would never hear a prophet, because the prophet came in looking, everybody thinks it's okay. They're worshiping idols in Israel. It's all okay. Here goes one guy comes in and says, hey guys, you're not supposed to be doing this. This is wrong. What do they want to do, those prophets, all the time? Kill them, stone them, run them out of town. We don't want to hear it. They get all upset. That's how people are being trained politically. The reality, and religiously, the reality is we need to have our ears open, our brains plugged in, our nose in the books studying, and our hearts open and humble to listen to other viewpoints that sound different than what we're used to, so that we can learn and grow and not be blind. So this concept of social responsibility, we'll get back to this concept. It starts with the fact that we're all connected. Light, which is the model of the Torah and truth, it radiates. So it radiates out. Light impacts everything around it. It does more for its environment, for things around it, than it does for itself. Light in itself isn't just there to illuminate itself, it illuminates everything else. So if you look at the tabernacle, you see in the center you have Yod-Heh. You have in the very center the Holy of Holies. The Torah, the truth, is in the very center. It radiates out to the priests, right? We're talking about the structure in this week's Parashat, we learned. The priests then are around the tabernacle, and the priests get the Torah and they teach the children of Israel. So it radiates out to the children who make up the outskirts of the nation of Israel. So if it radiates, it means that it's connected to a source. That goes back to that concept of accountability. It means there's a source, a standard, and there's an authority that's behind that standard. And it radiates out to all people. So this concept of social responsibility means you're connected to other people. So what you do, good and bad, connects. It either, like the concept of being outside the camp. When there's a sickness, someone's put outside the camp. It's removed from the camp. So when there's sin, it's removed from the camp, as we see all throughout the Torah. And at the same time, righteousness is supposed to radiate out to all the people. So what you do is connected to society. And in the same way, people went to go fight for war. That means you may die for your society. And you had that responsibility. Everybody did. There's no respecters of persons with God. So the next thing we see is this concept, like an example where we see leaders among the people. The social responsibility that people had, even when Mashiach said, if someone has asked you for your coat, offer him your hat also. If he asks you to walk a mile, go 2. It didn't say, hey, he needs a coat. I worked for my coat. Why can't he go work and buy his own coat? This concept would never fly in a Torah-based society. The fact was, every time you had any increase, you were to not consume it all, to give a portion to those who were in need. Not only that, Mashiach teaches that if someone asked you for something, you were to exceed their expectations of what they needed. To, as it says, open your hand wide. If your brother who is poor among you asked for him, you will open your hand wide and surely fulfill his need. So here's a concept where we see all throughout the scriptures, just like when he said, I was hungry and you fed me not, and thirsty and you fed me not. And they said, the religious leaders said, when were you hungry? When did we not feed you? The reality was, he said, as you did all those, you did to me. Because the Torah, we're all connected. The Torah emanates out. And you see that how we treat each other, the great commandments, the second great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, is how we interact with others, because we're all connected. How you would treat your own hand affects how your whole body's health is. You cut your hand off and it bleeds, won't the blood remove blood from the whole body? So you have to be cautious of all your members and careful with all of them. So next we look at the leaders that are among the people. Out of those people, Moshe took the 12 princes from the children of Israel. And they were to help him count all the tribes. So being a leader, like we think of being a leader, is like you're going to be served. Look at Mashiach. He washed the feet of his disciples. He was a greater servant, not a leader that expected greater service to himself. And this is something, going back to the social responsibility, that we have a responsibility. If you have 2 coats, go out and find a Torah observant person who doesn't have a coat and give it to them. This is this concept of this leadership, that you have this power, influence, or wealth among Israel. Then you're to serve with that, to glorify Yodewahe with that, to help your brothers with that. And that's something that's really lacking in our community that could be increased. Next, we look at this concept of positions, where everybody was according to the house. It's about knowing your position, knowing your roles. It's easy to get comfortable to go, gosh, I'll just do what I want. I want to live in the south. Well, if you're of the tribe of Asher, you live in the north because God said so. You won't know that if you don't listen to Moshe. Listening to Moshe is like studying the Torah. You got to study the Torah to know what the rules are. That's even the rules of how the whole house of Israel, the tribe, how they move. It all has specific rules. Just because you're a priest doesn't mean you can do anything. Uzziyahu touched the ark and was killed because in this week's Parashat, in Numbers 4:15, it says, you shall not touch the holy things to those tribes. They were to be covered up and moved, but they weren't to touch them. So you can't think that you can break one of the commandments because you're chosen by God, or because you already have a nice position, you can get away with doing other things. No, you're being prepared to obey in the future. This book, it's not about membership. Most people think it's about membership. Ooh, I'm a Jew, I'm a chosen person. So what? There was all kinds of people, the children of Israel, and God killed them because they wouldn't obey him. So what good did it do to say, hey, I was one of the saved, chosen seed of Abraham that came out of his Mitzrayim? Who cares? If you won't obey Yodewahe, it was probably a curse to you to draw close to him in disobedience, because that would equal your death. It'd been better to be a Philistine way far away that God hasn't punished yet. So we get this concept. You go to the Christians, they want, it's about saying the sinner's prayer, then we get this heaven, we get our sins forgiven. We're in this membership. It isn't about membership. Membership is all about getting in. But in the Torah, it's all about staying in. It's about being able to draw closer. And the closer you draw to something so pure and holy as God, the more your flaws will be removed, the more that they'll be revealed. So this is really about roles and responsibilities and accountability. And what I hope you get out of this is that we're responsible to one another. We're responsible to ourselves to have self-discipline and do what's right. That's the Torah in the center. And then how we interact. We're responsible for our brethren. We're responsible for how we act and how we help others so that we can as a whole be a healthy body. And there's roles and responsibilities. This isn't just a faith that is, hey, this is easy, we want to sign up for a membership. This is something we study. We study to learn so we can do a better job individually, but we don't hide that light under a bushel. The light is not for itself. The light is for all around it so that it emanates out and is magnified. And just as Mashiach magnified the Torah, so should we also. So that's my message for this year. Until next Parashat, I say to you, Shalom.